you all for coming, for staying with the program into the afternoon. Our moderator scheduled for today was Felix Adeko. I am substituting for him. My name is Michael Budde. I am a professor of political science and Catholic studies here at DePaul University. I'm also a research scholar in the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. In the interest of time, I will not do justice to the many accomplishments of our speakers this afternoon. We have a total of 90 minutes for this session. We will adjourn at 5 p.m. I would like to begin by introducing our first speaker, whose name regrettably was misspelled on the program biography, and he was too kind to bring that to our attention until now. Marcelo Camurça is professor of social science and religious studies at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Minas Gerais, Brazil. He's published extensively in the social scientific study of religion and social movements, ranging from Pentecostal religion in Brazil to revolutionary movements. He's a widely traveled and heavily published scholar who we are thrilled to have with us today. His English language skills are more than competent, but to assist him in the discussion and question section of our program this afternoon, he will be assisted by Anna Paula Manzarini, who will also participate as an associate in the conversation this afternoon. So without further ado, Marcelo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here today. My special thanks goes to the DePaul University staff, Bill, Francis, Mike, Karen, who kindly invited me to take part in this outstanding discussion with scholars from all over the world. We all know the conference called Fire from Heaven was a clear and inspiring reference to Harvey Cox's books published in 1995 with the same title. In his analysis, the author describes the Pentecostal phenomenon. His finds show that, contrary to those of the Secular City, published in 1966, Pentecostal Christianity is not a backward-looking movement. Following a similar line of reasoning, I would like to focus upon some aspects of Catholic Charismatic Renewal in Brazil, in short, CCR, and other charismatic new communities in Brazil, and claim that the recreation of tradition undergone by charismatic practices leads to an innovative openness to modern and postmodern worlds. The first point I would like to introduce is how the concept of religion's tradition is apprehended by charismatics in my country. Tradition, in their view, is less a theoretical concept than a set of practices, such as the worship of images of the Virgin Mary at home and temples, her appearance, rites of blessing with the Blessed Sacrament, in houses, objects, and people, pray the Rosary, novenas in First Fridays, and so on. That's traditional novenas, children of praying with the Rosary, the family, blessing with the Blessed Sacrament. Everything that appeared obsolete after the internal secularization undergone by the Second Vatican Council was introduced en masse by CCR in Brazil. The appraisal of tradition, however, comprises all kinds of charismatic elements, such as gifts of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, the glossolalia, prophecy, baptism, and rest in the Spirit. In my view, it would miss the point if we interpret this phenomenon just as a simple liturgical setback or a sort of irrational regression to the past. Based on what I have observed, it is more than that. It is a recreation of the tradition, so to speak, driven by the need to adapt old rituals to postmodernity. In this sense, recreation of tradition is close to Eric Hobsbawm's notion, the invention of tradition, in a modern fashion. It is mean tradition renewed by a subject experience and personal choice of the faithful. Traditional live as an atavistic binding force, yet experience as a free option. Despite the fact that CCR in Brazil presents itself as a movement of the spirit and not as an organization, it must operate the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church. It seems to me that the Spirit does not blow where it wants, but only inside the church. Extra ecclesia nulla salus, no salvation outside the church. Yet, the individual membership to the church does not necessarily occur via the imposition of catechesis, but via mystical experience, such as glossolalia, healing and prophecy, to which every baptized have access. Sure, this process of affiliation does not preclude the traditional one, but it promotes a successful articulation of the traditional Catholic idea of salvation by the church with the modern Protestant stand of salvation by faith. An ingenious formula, since indeed we are saved by faith, but only in and through the church. CCR claims to offer a unique spiritual experience to individuals and promise a dramatic renewal of the church life based on a spirituality of personal relation with Jesus and direct access to power and inspiration through a series of spiritual gifts or charisms. Identity is expressed as a sense of coming to know who I am in Christ. This kind of CCR identity combines a very modern lifestyle with traditional religious practices. However, the simple content of a profane modern life passes through a kind of purification or, on call, a spiritual exorcism, so that they could be incorporated into charismatic ethos. Some examples may illustrate how this blend of traditional and postmodern elements unfolds during charismatic events in Brazil. The pagan-inspired Halloween became the happy day of All Saints, in which those of younger celebrate their choice in terms of celestial support: Lucy, Anthony, Benedict, Francis, and so on. They dance and chant to the sound of techno music, rock and roll, and samba, under the watchful eyes of local church authorities. Charismatic leaders expel evil spirits like drugs, sex, and violence, which are exorcised through rituals of blessings, laying of the hands, and repetition of loud under songs such as Devil Get Out. Look at these nightclubs called Christ nightclubs, where charismatic Catholic youth dancing modern music with religious content. Those Catholic rock bands, another one. Charismatic Catholic rock band. They were also t-shirts with morally oriented slogans like such as 100% virgin or chastity an option. This guy put this t-shirt. Now I choose to wait. He choose to wait. He should have sex only after his wedding. The broad use of the internet and online charismatic propaganda is another case of mixture between traditional past and the upcoming future. Websites like Canção Nova offer visitors every tool they might need to be connected with the divine, from online radio and TV to spiritual assistance through chat rooms and SMS and Twitter messaging. Special attention is devoted to young people who find all sorts of digital interactive gadgets at their disposition, such as virtual altar, pilgrimage, and way of the cross. Requests for grace and miracles are performed through online candle lighting and clicks on web angels or on Jesus is Cool. Here you can see the virtual altar or virtual candles. Note that all these multimodal and self and mass media communication tools are at the service of a deep conservative agenda, which combines old preconciliar rituals with charismatic experience, moral condemnation of contraceptives and homosexual, with expression of modern mysticism. Thanks to this blend, anyone today can receive the gift of praying in heavenly tongues, the gift of healing the sick, and the gift of prophecy through the power of Jesus. Reverse. Similar to its counterpart in North America, the Charismatics in Brazil is a movement that incorporates Pentecostal practice into Catholicism. In the nearly 3 decades since its inception, the movement has developed a system that includes several genres of language used in charismatic ritual settings. Prophecy is a first-person pronouncement in which the I is God, who speaks through someone, revealing his mind and will. Teaching is a ritual that clarifies spiritual truth and helps the faithful to live a better life. Prayer includes worship, petition, and intercession on behalf of another for a special purpose, such as physical healing, emotional healing, and deliverance from evil spirits. Finally, sharing is a kind of ordinary conversation, except that its content must have some spiritual values. Thomas Shore described the performance of the faith healer in therapeutic ritual through the phenomenology of self and self-transformation, and he calls it sacred self. I, myself, used a metaphor to describe such rituals as wild psychology, whereby painful memories of the people's past are activated and traumas are reviewed, experienced, and extinguished by intercession of the Holy Catholic collection of images. In my view, the sacred self engendered by charismatics in Brazil also comprise a successful combination of traditionalism and postmodernity in the way they socialize themselves into the local church. The traditional way takes place through the affiliation to a visible organization, the Roman Catholic Church, with its millennial heritage of dogmas, rituals, and sacraments. The postmodern one, widely observed among the charismatics followers, happens mostly through an inner personal encounter with Jesus. That's precisely the kind of collective phenomenon that we can observe in large scale during the charismatic meetings held in football stadiums with more than 100,000 people in Brazil. With the presence of the upper hierarchy of Catholic Church, charismatic priests and lay hand the show and control, with participants will be allowed to prophesy or share. Rituals of self-affirmation like healing and deliverance deal with psychology modern disease such as low self-esteem, depression, and anxiety. In these rituals, we observe the role of memory. I can show that's the priest, the charismatic priest, that's Marcelo Camurça, one of the famous charismatic priests. That's the pop stars priests. They song, and now I will tell you about the healing rituals. In these rituals, we observe the role of memory in the healing process by activating the painful memories of the past when the trauma is revealed, experienced, and healed with the help of all sorts of holy intercessions. In the core of CCR, rituals of self-affirmation such as prayer meetings, initiation ceremonies, and healing services lies the belief in neural and mental performative actions. It is through the power of the word, the memory, and the staging of dramas that the transformation occurs. These remarks help us to understand the role of faith therapy in charismatics in Brazil. Two charismatic healers and a middle-aged man who was seeking cure find themselves in the center stage of one such ritual. When asked why he came, the man replied, "Cure my depression." Then the healer says, laying his hand on the man's head, Lord Jesus, by the power of thy blood, cure this man." Jesus touched his brain, the seat of feelings, healed the memories that motivated the lack of serotonin, especially the one of the day that his daughter said she was ashamed of her father. Then the man begins to cry, and then the healer starts saying prayers in heavenly tongues. I'm not a healer, but he says something like that. Shumalala, hianla, do, da, ha, ha. The person who identifies him and herself with the situation fall into tears. The symbolic method of adding a Catholic image, the blood of Jesus that washes and heals, the mantle of Mary that covers and protects, the wounded palm of Jesus' head enters the hurt and plucks the hurts and resentments, the fire of the Spirit that baptizes. All this identifies the power of these images with the origin of the trauma, putting it out through forgiveness of those who caused the suffering through the staging of the embrace. Conclusion. To sum up my presentation, I would say that charismatic healing in Brazil is not only the relief of illness or distress, but also an instrument of building the sacred self, like Shordas, for both healers and patients. The charismatic sacred self is an authentic expression of a modern subjectivity driven by religious emotional experience. The aspect of the sacred self fully accepts the symbolic heritage of Catholic tradition, albeit dressed in a modern fashion, and turns the Pentecost myth into amazing individual experience, which explains the remarkable success of this movement within the Catholic Church in Brazil. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Terry Ray, sociologist, currently serving as an associate professor of religious studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. Terry's interests range widely in social anthropology and social theory, working both in Haiti, including a stint at the University of, at the State University of Haiti for some time, as well as now more recently moving into work studying Haitian and other African diaspora migrants finding their way to the United States. Please join me in welcoming Terry.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone at the Center for this wonderful event, for inviting me. I'm quite flattered. I'm the last panelist, and that's because I have the shortest flight home. Philadelphia is less than 2 hours by plane. And I've come to realize that when William Penn founded Pennsylvania as a holy experiment, I wondered if he had in mind the Charismatic Renewal being spawned out of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania being home to the only Sufi shrine in North America, and the site of Bob Marley's last concert. So the holy experiment continues, I think. All right, so I'd also like to applaud the choir at Mass today. For a group of people who never rehearsed once together before, I thought we sounded great. Baritones, altos, tenors, it's quite a pleasure to be a part of that. So I have a PowerPoint presentation tied to a lecture, and yes, that is Pat Robertson. No, he is not Haitian, but that will explain itself momentarily. It's an auspicious time and place to be speaking about both Haiti and an earthquake, because Haiti, of course, is the root of Chicago. This city was founded by a Haitian, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. And to reflect upon an earthquake today perhaps will inspire us all to be sympathetic and prayerful for Japan and Ecuador, who've experienced terrible earthquakes within the last 72 hours, right? So this paper is entitled Fear and Trembling in Haiti, a Charismatic Catholic Prophecy of the 2010 Earthquake. And given that title, I must open with a quote from Kierkegaard: "If anyone on the verge of action should judge himself according to the outcome, he would never begin." On January 12, 2010, a massive earthquake struck Haiti, its epicenter near the capital city of Port-au-Prince, killing 250,000 people in a matter of minutes. 9 months earlier, the catastrophic tragedy had been prophesied by Father Jules Campion during a fiery sermon at the annual National Congress of the Haitian Catholic Charismatic Renewal before tens of thousands of believers. What were the sins for which God so chose to punish Haiti, according to this highly popular priest? And what are the influences and the contours of this cleric's charisma in particular, and of the renewal in general, in Haitian Catholicism? This paper explores these questions through a close reading of his prophetic sermon, while placing Campion's ministry and Haitian Catholic Pentecostalism in broader social, historical, and political context. And excerpts from the sermon have been distributed. You might be sitting on them. So. All right. Though founded in 1973, the Charismatic Renewal got off to a slow start in Haiti, with only 600 members to show for its efforts by the end of that decade. There were thus few signs that it would soon change the face of Haitian Catholicism forever. Linguistic domination and classism had much to do with the renewal's inauspicious start, as in the early years the movement held its services and revivals in French, a language spoken by only 10% of the national population, thereby shutting out the poor almost entirely. Poor Catholics in Haiti had prior been captivated by liberation theology, which spawned a base church movement in Haiti that was called L'Église, which means little church. L'Église priests generally did not rail against the so-called idolatry of voodoo from the pulpit, instead railing against political injustice and the structural causes of the perpetually abject poverty of the nation's masses. Which button? The right one? Yeah. Okay. In fact, Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide, L'Église's leading prophet, had voodooist symbols embroidered into his soul and his cassock, and was widely believed to actively participate personally in voodoo rituals. Aristide was also the leading force behind L'Église's contribution to the fall of the dynastic Duvalier regime, which had ruled Haiti with an iron fist from 1957 to 1987. And if you look on his cassock, his soul, he has the words in Haitian Creole, parole de délivrance. Deliverance is a word that we've heard quite often during the weekend. He meant something quite different from it than what Pentecostals would. He meant deliverance from political oppression. And here on his cassock also is a drum, and the drum is a symbol par excellence of voodoo, Haitian voodoo, the African-based religion of Brazil. In a stunning political development, 4 years after, in 1990, Aristide was elected president of Haiti by the greatest electoral margin of victory in Latin American history. For the first time ever, the Haitian poor had a president who understood them and who cared for them. Hope thus abounded among the subaltern. The economic elite and the army were none too pleased to see this firebrand prelate in power, however, and soon they burst the elation of the masses by orchestrating a coup d'etat, driving Aristide into exile and placing General Raoul in charge of the junta. The Cedras regime launched into a systematic campaign to terrorize, torture, and eliminate Aristide's supporters, sounding the death knell of L'Église, which echoed loudly throughout the land and cast the poor Haitian voodooists and Catholics adrift once again. It was around this time that the Charismatic Renewal began speaking Haitian Creole, and the results have been astonishing. By the mid-1990s, well, I won't read the results, let me just point to this. Is there a pointer on this thing? Okay, well, so L'Église and the base church community, the base church movement, they are founded around the same time, 1973 and 1974 respectively. As you can see, there are only 600 members of the Renewal by 1980, but by 1984 there were over 5,000 base church communities throughout the country. 1986, the Duvalier regime was toppled. The coup against Aristide is in 1991, and we see the demise of the base church community and liberation theology at that point in time. 1994 is the first National Annual Congress of the CCR. 2000, Father Campion, he is appointed pastor of the Sacred Heart Church, and by now there are 780,000 members in the CCR in Haiti, so there's tremendous growth in the movement. In 2002, 100,000 people attend the 8th Annual CCR Congress, and in 2010, there's a massive earthquake that kills 250,000 people, and projections are that by 2025, 1.77 million Haitians will be active in the Charismatic Renewal, or 1 out of every 7 people in the country. A key question for charting the Renewal's course in Haiti, future course in Haiti, is this: how does the earthquake change things? What new forms of spiritual transformation can be expected moving forward in the face of one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the Americas? How do these forces prime the faithful to believe and to act? Before exploring these questions specifically and looking at Father Campion's sermon, let us take a look at two of the largest earlier earthquakes in Haitian history, 1770 and 1842. So there's a long section of my paper that talks about earthquakes during these two catastrophes, 1770 and 1842. This is an image of the geographic fault called the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault, which runs directly under the capital city of Port-au-Prince. The earthquakes of 1770 and 2010 happened in exactly the same location. The 1842 earthquake happened through the northern fault. You can see it passing through the north along the coast of Haiti, right by the second largest city in the country, Cape Haitian, and the fault runs between the island of Île la Tortue, or Turtle Island, as it were. So this is just a paragraph from a letter written in 1770 by a French settler in Saint-Domingue, which was the French colony that would become Haiti in 1804. He's writing to his sister, and here is what he has to say. I was doing extensive research to see if any other prophet had ever predicted an earthquake in Haiti. And so this is the closest I got to 1770 and this 1842 event. We have just gone through one of the most horrible events through which divine rage can terrify the human being. The day of Pentecost, we endured several brisk quakes of the earth. In an instant were in ruins 3 of the colony cities, Port-au-Prince, Léogane, and Petit-Goâve. A number of slaves and free coloreds were also crushed under the ruins of their houses. If the houses were more than one story, the scene would have been even more horrible than Lisbon. Meanwhile, the bell still rings in the plantation tower, and we have seen a loaded wagon roll by, unhitched to any horses, moved by the simple trembling of the earth. First day of Pentecost, trembling earth, ringing bells. The end is near, right? That's not all, dear sister. An impostor attempted to profit the occasion by adding furies of fanaticism to the chaos of the elements. This man, dressed in the habit of a Spanish Dominican, although he really was a Jesuit, and the Jesuits had been expelled from Haiti in 1763, and some of them lingered on, like this guy, but he had to disguise himself as a Dominican. This man, dressed in the habit of a Spanish Dominican, went about exhorting the people to repent for their sins by giving abundant sums of charity, which in fact he never failed to pocket. The slaves and the free blacks gave everything to him. To repay them, he prophesied that the island, quote, was to be destroyed, but that only the whites would perish. Except for him, I suppose, because he was white at this time. 1842. This is a paragraph written by a man named Demesvar Delorme 40 years after the event. He's recalling his experience. Demesvar Delorme recalled that he, then an 11-year-old boy, was playing marbles with his brother not far from the cathedral in Cape Haitian when the earthquake struck. The bell tower of the cathedral before me started to sway all over the place, its bells chiming without rhythm a sinister, horrible death knell. Next, the bell tower tumbled, then the entire church collapsed. Once the earth settled, Delorme took off his shoes because he believed it to be the end of the world, and at an apocalyptic moment such as this, quote, it is necessary to appear barefoot before the eternal. For that reason, when I'm buried, I don't want any shoes on. Before long, Monsignor Toribio, the Spanish curate of the parish, with a crucifix in his hand, approached the boys and implored them with the words that Delorme would never forget. My children, run for the hills. As fast as you can, run for the hills. On to 2010. To some observers, all right, actually, there's a statement before that question. Here we go. Because I slashed out a lot of this. You know how you would present a paper, you were slashing paragraphs and stuff. Here we go. 2010, of course, persistent belief in the goodness of God makes the question, why, all the more daunting. Why Haiti? Why this? In 2009, 4 hurricanes in 3 weeks. Last decade, a civil rebellion that ousted a beloved president. The decade before that, a military junta that slaughtered thousands of innocent citizens and systematically raped hundreds of Haitian women and girls. The century before that, another earthquake that killed thousands. And the century before that, 100 years of human bondage. Why Haiti? To some observers, the answer to this question is that Haiti is cursed or indebted to Satan. Here is one version of this interpretation of events by American televangelist Pat Robertson, and I'll let him speak for himself.
Christy, something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people may not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French. Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. True story. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. The Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor. That island of Hispaniola is one island. It's cut down the middle. On the one side is Haiti, on the other side is the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is prosperous, healthy, full of resorts, etc. Haiti is in desperate poverty. Same islands. They need to have, and we need to pray for them, a great turning to God. And out of this tragedy, I'm optimistic something good may come. But right now, we're helping the suffering people, and the suffering is unimaginable.
Absolutely, Pat.
And
All right, let's stop him.
Christy.
Robertson's comments caused quite an uproar and were widely and deservedly, in my view, criticized. But one important fact was seldom alluded to in the ensuing media rancor, that many Haitians, especially evangelical Protestants, believe precisely the same thing, and increasingly many Catholics as well, Catholics in the Renewal. As a result of this theory's currency in post-earthquake Haiti, furthermore, voodoo practitioners are now sometimes forced to defend themselves against violent crowds of angry Christians. There is thus good reason for concern that a new wave of religious persecution is rising out of the rubble of the earthquake. Meanwhile, the most influential voodoo priest in the country, Max Beauvoir, vowed that a response to the war waged against voodooists would be a war waged on Christians by voodoo. Another voodoo priest, meanwhile, has suggested just the inverse of Robertson's theory, that the 2010 quake was the fault of Christianity, in fact, or at least of the Catholic Church and other supposedly corrupt institutions in Haiti, and I quote, "If all of a sudden, in 15 seconds, 20 seconds, all the physical representations of corruption are destroyed, it gives you pause for thought. The Justice Ministry, down. The National Palace, down. The United Nations headquarters, down. When there is all this corruption going on, whose role is it in society to speak? Isn't the church supposed to say something?" I note happily that the Barbancourt rum distillery was intact after the earthquake. And if I were a voodooist, which I'm not, I would read into that something quite extraordinary, that rum is essential to the practice of voodoo. You couldn't have a voodoo ceremony without a bottle of this rum. And so the voodoo spirits protected this distillery while God couldn't protect the cathedral. And this is a picture of the presidential palace in Haiti. There was a day of prayer a few weeks after the earthquake. There were several 100,000 people of all faiths, right? And Haiti is a largely Catholic, voodooist, and Protestant, but a growing Islamic community as well. And you can see the presidential palace was destroyed during the earthquake. The church would have much to say, of course, in the wake of the tragedy, and none of its religious specialists would say more and with more influence than Father Jules Campion. He had prophesied the earthquake, after all, so who better explain its divine meaning than him? And just what was the content of his remarkable prophecy of April 2009? We will answer that question in just a moment, but first let's take a glimpse at his ministry leading up to this stunning event. And I won't take too much of a glimpse, but I did bring a couple of paragraphs from my field notes at one of his revivals, just to give you an idea of the power of this man. He's the most charismatic priest I have ever been around, and I mean that both sociologically and theologically, although I am deeply disturbed by some of his messages. Unlike the courageous denunciations of social justice that characterize the liberation theology in Haiti, strong denunciations of voodoo are often cast from the pulpits of charismatic Catholic priests in Haiti. Having studied in Jerusalem and Rome and being a very successful fundraiser, that counts for a lot in religion, doesn't it? Campion is clearly the most influential Haitian priest in the movement. Michael the Archangel is prominent among the dozens of icons who inhabit the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Turgeau, in Port-au-Prince, and this is Father Campion. And in 2000, he was called to pastor this church, and as soon as he becomes pastor of Sacred Heart in Turgeau, he transforms this church into the epicenter of this growing charismatic renewal. He installs dozens of new statues. He builds a Mount Golgotha behind the church where pilgrims will walk up on their knees and kiss the feet of Christ crucified and so on. It was a remarkable transformation, and this is the first church I revisited when I moved to Haiti in 1992, and I lived there for 6 years, and I frequented this church, but the transformation was extraordinary by his fundraising, because, you know, statues cost money. A lot of Catholics don't realize that, but they cost money, you know? So. Michael the Archangel is prominent among the dozens of icons who inhabit Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Port-au-Prince. Soon after he assumed his pastorate in 2000, I already said that, and so let me jump to these 2 paragraphs from my field notes. Right before 10 o'clock, Campion enters the church and lights several candles and places them here and there. Next, he drops to his knees behind the altar, facing the crucifix and the tabernacle, with his arms outstretched in silent prayer. He stays like this for several minutes. By now, there are well over 1,000 people in the church, roughly 90% of them women. It is a standing room crowd only. A few minutes pass, then Campion approaches the pulpit to call the faithful to prayer. And he has a bellowing voice, which I can't imitate, so I won't even try. 10h07 à genoux, which in French means 10:07 to your knees. And why 7 after 10 is the moment where you fall to your knees, I do not know. It is a striking moment. In a single heartbeat, the faithful fall collectively to their knees in effervescence. This continues over the next hour or so, a series of formulaic prayers. He chants, Jesus, Jesus, Alleluia, 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 and this goes on for 45 minutes, and it sweeps everyone up in its orbit. Next, Campion begins preaching in Haitian Creole and denounces the spies that infiltrate Sacred Heart Church in stealth efforts to undermine him and the Holy Spirits. Mind you, I'm an anthropologist. I'm in this place with a tape recorder. He explains that he knows there are spies in the church today who have tape recorders and cameras, and that these malfaiteurs, which sounds better in French than in the English, malefactors in English, but malfaiteurs in French. These malfaiteurs would awaken tomorrow to find boils all over their bodies, having provoked the wrath of God. A woman behind me notices my tape recorder and points it out to several people around her, at one point calling me a spy and screaming as much out loud, "Méli, messieurs, c'est blanc salier." That's Haitian Creole. This is the guy, it's the white guy, he's the spy. For a moment, I, the only white person in the church, am gripped by an image of 1,000 entranced, enraged women tearing me apart limb by limb for my sacrilegious transgression. I demurely turn off the tape and slip the recorder into my backpack, sit on the thing, and am relieved when the denunciations end and the ecstatic chanting begins anew, the collective effervescence quelling the rage against the spy. I would become even more relieved to wake up the next morning to discover no boils on my skin. Jesus, hallelujah, indeed. So we can turn to his sermon, and I have printed it out, or Karen printed it out, thank you very much. And I don't propose that we read this entire thing, but I will put the background of, there's a recording of the sermon. And I will mute it because it's in Haitian Creole, but toward the end I would like to bring his voice into the room because you'll get the sense. We have 5 minutes left? All right, so let me just read a couple of the paragraphs from the sermon, and then I'll put him as the background for the rest of the 5 minutes. So there are 70,000 people listening to him this day. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from the excerpts that I've shared with you, and then I'll spend the last 3.5 minutes on my conclusion. My brothers and sisters, in just a few minutes we are going to celebrate the evening of Pentecost and the effusion of the Holy Spirit. This will be preceded by a teaching that I'm going to share with you on the subject of the Holy Spirit, a sermon. This could be the last chance that you have for me to deliver to you this message. I bring this message to you because over the last few months, God has been placing it in my heart. It's a message to deliver before we receive the sacrament at 3:30. And because Jesus is telling me to give this to you, this message. You shouldn't panic when God gives you the messages. It is to invite us to prayer and to conversion. Thus the message. Pay very careful attention because this is the last time. So I'll skip over some of this because Campion teaches that Haiti is chosen to be first among nations by God. Haiti should be the light among nations by God, and it is the sin of the Haitian people that is keeping this plan of the divine from being realized. We have our own selves to blame. So let's see. All right, so look at this big mountain that surrounds Port-au-Prince, and soon you'll see him pointing to the mountain. According to many studies conducted by scientists that have been published, you can find them on the internet, it's science, they see that beneath that mountain there is something that they call a geological fault, that there's a cliff beneath the under the mountain. People will be crushed in their houses for miles around, and even the earthquake can cause something of a tsunami. There are scientific warnings. But there are conditions, by that he means there are conditions for Haiti to become light among nations. For the protection of Port-au-Prince, I say to you the first condition is prayer. Prayer has extraordinary power. I ask you to pray. Second condition, Jesus has a plan for Haiti, and we have our place in this plan. Above all, we must be converted, and we must try to avoid sinning. Particularly, there are sins that really anger God, and you can open the Bible to see one such sin that makes God angry with us is idolatry. It's the voodoo spirits, and most Haitians are devoted to them. Even those who go to church regularly, they are hypocrites. They turn to voodoo priestesses and priests and perform services for the spirits, play music for the spirits, turn people into zombies, employ sorcery to kill people. They're half in the church, half in the voodoo temple, and this compromises the church. We must avoid the sin of idolatry. If not, God will know. Jesus lives in the sacrament, and if our people do not turn away from voodoo, Jesus will cause something to happen beneath those mountains. And the third thing, if you're doing any of these things, you must beg forgiveness and be repentant. He writes, he says, the third thing that makes God angry with this country, something that made God destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which today are found beneath the hills of Israel. The third sin that provokes the wrath of God and a deluge of destruction. This vice that so angers God and so many people we cannot understand are involved with this. Boy with boy, girl with girl, you yourselves do not respect God's plan. Look at nature. We never see a male dog lying with a male dog. You never see a female dog lying with a female dog. Even rarer, you never see a male pig lying with a male pig. That which a dog doesn't do, which a pig doesn't do, the children of Mary are doing it, and it outrages God, I say unto you. I conclude with this. I leave you with one final message in the name of Jesus. If you not cease with this evil behavior, as we have the living Jesus in the sacrament, there will be no Port-au-Prince encore anymore. The plan of Jesus will be realized in another generation in truth. Either we convert or we die. Even little babies will die and will be cast into the flames of hell, a double death. Amen. So let me just give him 30 seconds of time, because it's at the end. Let's give him some volume too. Right around here is when he talks about the pigs and the dogs, which to me is...
devant Jésus. Mais Jésus connaît, tu sais tout, Jésus. Et tu sais de quoi je veux parler, Jésus. C'est seul nous-mêmes qui va respecter le plan, mon Dieu. Même bête, animaux, pas je vois un malade chien coucher avec un malade chien. Pas je vois une femelle chienne coucher avec une femelle chienne.
Female dog, and the pig part is the climax of the story.
Pire. Pas je vois un malade cochon coucher avec un malade cochon.
It's fire and brimstone stuff. It's
cochon, mon frère. Puis c'est pas mon mari à faire. Et vous dites merci, je vous dis. Je termine avec ceci. C'est le dernier message que je vous lance au nom de Jésus. Si tu m'as quitté cette malpropreté,
if you don't leave this
c'est
filth,
vrai que Jésus vivant dans le sacrement.
and he grabs the monstrance and
All
right, so I need to read my conclusion because I'm almost out of time, so let me get to it. And that was the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption in Port-au-Prince, the National Cathedral. And that is a VV for voodoo. This is Monsignor Joseph Serge Millot. He was the Archbishop of Port-au-Prince. He died during the earthquake. And the future. One wonders what a conversation about the earthquake between Reverend Pat Robertson and Father Jules Campion would be like. Robertson surely knows little about Haiti. I mean, Napoleon III was born in 1808, the Haitian Revolution was won in 1804, so how Napoleon III? He had few details to offer when he blamed the 2010 quake on Haiti's revolutionary pact with the devil. Campion did mention Satan in his prophecy, alluding to people who rely solely on science and not the Bible for truth, and surely he associates sin with Satan. Thus, fundamentally, Robertson and Campion were saying the same thing, that Haiti was punished by God with the earthquake because its people give in to sin. And although Robertson was widely lambasted for his outrageous claim, Campion continues to preach uncontested in Haiti and the Haitian diaspora. His statue as a prophet flourishing, his Facebook page accumulating likes. They each buy into the same narrative about Haiti deserving its plight because of sin, the end result being sanctimonious hatred for voodooists and gays, and a step back into the religious intolerance that has marked the nation since the colonial era. Campion's charismatic crusade continues, and he warns that a second January 12th will befall the Haitian people should they not convert. Many people are listening and buying into his proclamation that Haiti is the new Israel and that God's plan for the nation to be realized. There has to be a cleansing, a word that he uses in his preaching quite often. Among the sins to be cleansed, Campion highlights voodoo, abortion, and homosexuality. And cleansing the nation of these things seems to be his understanding of the raison d'etre of the charismatic renewal. Though I have not done the requisite field work to know this for sure, I suspect that the recent rise in homophobic demonstrations and attacks on gays in Haiti are not unrelated to his growing rise in popularity as a prophet. The International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission reports an increase of attacks on homosexuals following the earthquake, while a new ecumenical interfaith organization called the Haitian Coalition of Religious and Moral Organizations has organized anti-gay demonstrations, one of which in 2013 featured the beating to death of two men presumed to be gay. Gay people will curse our country, as one protester put it, and we already have plenty of curses. One can only wonder if hatred also angers God into causing earthquakes. At any rate, the shift in the Haitian Catholic Church from liberation theology to Pentecostal revival has not been without deleterious social effect. Prophecy kills, and one can only hope that Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia be translated quickly into Creole. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. As before, we'll ask our speakers to take a seat up on the panel. Paula, feel free to join the conversation. Again, a reminder, if you have a question, please step to the center microphone, make your question brief and direct, and we have 30 minutes to begin the conversation.
Could we kill that PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
That'll take me about 10 minutes. How many PhDs does it take? Strong man.
Thank you both for your presentations. I think in both of your talks that we saw that with the contemporary charismatic renewal, there was a traditional element that was brought together with it. In terms of Brazil, even though a modern medium was used in the internet, you still had traditional devotions. In Haiti, you have the charismatic renewal with a message of more of a traditional tone rather than what you ended with Pope Francis's message on the family. Can you guys comment a little bit about the marriage of that? I mean, we talked a little bit about it this weekend where it's become a domestication or giving it a Catholic identity within the charismatic Pentecostal movement. But what have you found interesting in your part of the world?
I think that the renewal in Haiti has not been domesticated in the least, and part of that has to do with the instability following the earthquake. When the earthquake crushes an office in which the archbishop is killed, there's a vacuum, there's a leadership vacuum. It's interesting to point out that Archbishop Millot, before he died, he was actually reaching out to voodoo leaders around the country, and he was promoting interreligious dialogue with voodoo, and he actually said to them, please remind your people, the people who come to your temple, the people who come to you for divination and healing, remind them that they are still Catholics and we need them. How to read that? I think he's sincere. He was a beautiful man, and he was very open-minded, very patient, and I think he genuinely loved his flock. At the same time, he is head of a church that is losing members in droves, such that in the next generation or two, Haiti will be a majority Protestant nation. And how do you combat that? Well, you combat that by using the Charismatic Renewal to give people the spiritual buzz of Pentecostalism while keeping them in the church. And you also do that by getting voodooists to be counted as Catholics, which they consider themselves to be. But at three junctures in Haitian history, there were systematic campaigns to eradicate voodoo from Haitian society. So the tension has always been there. He was negotiating it brilliantly, and yet he died tragically in 2010. So.
Sorry for my short English, but I think that the Catholic Church it imitates the Pentecostal style. The Pentecostal, the Pentecostal church go first, and then in Brazil the census. The last census,
like the national census,
show that the Catholic members are leaving Catholic Church, and the evangelical people are growing up. Then that's the hierarchy of the church, of the Catholic Church, is very worried about that. Then they make some strategies to maintain these people inside the church. Then in this strategy, this is that kind of imitation of Pentecostal styles. But they put two things that devise charismatic renewal of the Pentecostal church, is the worship of to Virgin Mary and the obedience to the Pope. And then that's a formula that have a kind of success. And then, but the Catholic people has a lot of images, a lot of traditional patrimonies to use. Then I think that is an advantage to the Pentecostal church, to move this imaginary using this these ancient images that the Catholic Church belongs.
A question from Marcelo. It's very related, and maybe you have answered it, but I noticed your title is The Catholic Charismatic Renewal, a spiritual style between tradition and modernity. Are you deliberately making the point that it's only style that has changed, the substance, the thinking, everything else remains the same?
Thanks for your question, Paul. I'm not sure this, but I think the history, the Catholic history, has a patrimony that they use to move and to. I think the real enculturation that Charismatic Renewal is doing is to enculture the church in the modern society. And then even though, they have a conservative content, but they have success in doing this blend of traditional images of Catholic Church with this modern style of life, and then that makes a very success that maintains the Catholic Church like one of the first important churches in the world, in Brazil.
Just a quick question. You know, a lot of times we talk about the movement away from Catholicism to other types of religion, but it seems to me one of the big problems is it's not as much as so many people have moved away in Brazil, it's that the Catholic Church has not been there in Brazil. There hasn't been enough priests. There hasn't been enough sort of presence, and people who are seeking God are going to go where God is. So I'm curious on your point.
Yes, but even this charismatic movement, it began like a lay movement. Then we have a lot of lays that can attract people inside to Catholic Church, and also now we have charismatization of the priests, even the upper hierarchy of the Catholic Church. We have charismatic bishops now in Brazil.
My question is for Terry. When I heard you, when you set out the paper, I thought that we'd have a lot more discussion of time, because this is a like historical examination of prophecy, which is all about time, right, in an interesting way. So just wondering if you could talk, one of the sort of really interesting things, at least in the anthropological study of Christianity, is about the way that Christianity punctuates time, and particularly the way that different forms of Christianity punctuate time. The way that the future can get collapsed into the present, but equally the way in which the language that gets used a lot is it provides a rupture with the past, which is something that gets alluded to a lot here. Yeah. In reality, I think that language of rupture with the past is a little more complicated than it's often made out to be. But I'm wondering kind of just about if you could speak to the different kind of temporal horizons, or different, you can take that as you will, horizons, tempos, what have you, but basically the temporality of the different forms of Christianity, and also voodoo that you're talking about here.
Right. Voodoo doesn't concern itself with time whatsoever. It's not a religion that has any notion of linearity of time. There's no apocalypse in voodoo or anything. As for Christianity, and in particular, the Renewal, Father Campion, I would say that rather than collapsing the future into the present, he collapses the past into the present and ties it to the future. When he preaches more from the Hebrew Bible than from the Christian. I don't like to say New Testament, but most of his references are to biblical prophets, are to foils, as you saw in my case, and he is a very apocalyptic thinker, and he reads the apocalypse from the origin of humanity. But he places Haiti at this pinnacle of this historical narrative, of this apocalyptic narrative, because Haiti will lead the world to enlightenment unless these people remain sinners as they are, and you saw him screaming at them. So, and people listen, and you also caught a glimpse of the crowd, their reaction, and you only caught a glimpse of the people in the front seats. And these revivals, you have to pay for these front seats. And most of those folks, and I've been to a number of them, most of those folks are from Chicago, from Montreal, from Boston. They pay to fly there, and the poor are in the back, and you don't see their reaction. But the folks in the front, they were eating it up. They were overjoyed to hear what he had to say.
Thanks for the presentation. In view of your studies in trauma and meaning making, don't you think that your presentation functions more in that level than in prophecy? That it functions more on the level of trauma and meaning making than only question of time and prophecy?
That's a great question. When I revise this paper, I'll keep both of those suggestions in mind. They're very good ones. In terms of trauma, Haiti is already, prior to the earthquake, a society that was majority traumatized people. So traumatized people have serious psychological needs, and they turn to religion when they don't have. There are 15 psychiatrists in the entire country of 10 million people. So you go to priests and the Buddha priests and to Pentecostal revival for therapy. So trauma is a very important part of this story, and just think of how amplified the trauma has become since. There's still 600,000 people who are homeless in Haiti since the earthquake. So that's a very important part of the story. In terms of meaning making, he's got the meaning all figured out, Campion. And it's quite interesting that the hierarchy does not try to rein him in Haiti. I think they're intimidated by him themselves. There's a new archbishop, Monsignor Pollard, who doesn't seem to enter into the public sphere very often at all. And there is another bishop who attends some of the revivals that Campion leads. And mind you, this man has built huge retreat sites in Haiti, pilgrimage sites, with all these statues and these rosary gardens, and you go on the Stations of the Cross, they're 3 times the size of you. I mean, and so I think that they look at Campion, at least the people look at Campion as the true leader of the church. And just look at his Facebook page, he's adored, and he tweets like 4 or 5 times a day. He tweets all these Mother Angelica videos. Yeah.
I have a question for each one of you. The first question for you, Terry. Isn't it true that there is a difference between Pat Robertson and what Father Campion were doing? I mean, Campion stands within a certain kind of biblical tradition of prophecy, which has roots. Unless you repent, then you will be destroyed for this or that reason. Robertson, on the other hand, so they still have free will in his way of narrating it, whereas in Robertson's telling, they have no free will. The ancestors sold the soul to the devil, and this is just kind of fated now, and there's nothing they can sort of do about it except pray to be delivered from it. And so I'm wondering about, I mean, you seem to indicate at the end that prophecy is a bad thing, but of course, I'm sure you would agree that it depends what you're denouncing, right? I mean, if he was denouncing the sins of the upper classes and saying, this is the source of our misfortune, then that's a kind of good prophecy. Anyway, so I wanted I just asked you if you would reflect on that.
Yeah, sure.
For Marcelo, I would just wonder if you can talk a little bit about, you said this charismatic movement is a kind of postmodern movement, has these kind of postmodern elements. And I just wonder if you could, it's oftentimes called a kind of modern movement, and I wonder if you could talk about what's the difference between modern and postmodern in that sense.
When I say postmodern, I highlight the subject plus emotion. But modern in modern we work with individual but rationality, and postmodern for me is subjective, individual, more emotion. Then that's what I call wild psychology, is a kind of blend of a work with the memories, the painful memories, but they put the images, the traditional images, Catholic images, and finally, one hero represents the people who hurts, the man or the woman who has depression or sexual abuse, and they made a staging drama. They embrace this guy, this healer, and symbolize his father or his mother or the man who abused he or her. And then it's very interesting blends of a lot of things, the traditional images, psychology, modern psychology, emotion, drama, and then that things that I call postmodern. I don't know if
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for your question. It's a very good one, and as I refine this paper, obviously I must state very early on what I mean by prophecy and prophesy, because it's a complex issue, obviously. And I think that one of the keys to answering your question is rooted right here in Chicago, because there has been work done to try and find the origin of the idea that Haiti is cursed for its independence. And the story is tied to a voodoo ceremony in Haiti's national foundation myth on August 14th to August 15th, 1791. During the evening, a voodoo priest named Boukman, he led a rally of slaves from surrounding plantations in a place called Bois Caïman, which in English would mean alligator woods, I suppose, a cayman woods. And they have a ceremony in which Cecile Fatima, certainly a Muslim with a name like Fatima in 1791, she sacrifices a black pig, and there are drums and there are flames, and these people are getting rallied up in a very destructive form of collective effervescence. And the next day, the Haitian Revolution begins, and thousands of white people are slaughtered, plantations are burned, and 13 years later, Haiti becomes the first independent black nation in the Americas and the first independent black nation on earth. And the story that arises in the 1980s, early 1980s, is that at that ceremony, what really happened, in addition to sacrificing the pig, Cecile Fatima and Boukman, they swore a pact to Satan, a sort of Faustian pact with Satan. That idea first appears anywhere in print in a master's thesis in theology written right here in Chicago. Is Wheaton in Chicago or Trinity?
Yeah, outside of Chicago.
Just outside of Chicago. So Elizabeth McAllister is at Wesleyan, and she has an excellent article tracing the history of this idea, and she finds that Chicago is more or less ground zero for this idea, or the Chicago area. And there are...
It was a Wheaton College student that made it up?
Wheaton or Trinity, I know, but it was a Haitian who came to Wheaton or to Trinity to do a master's thesis in theology, working with someone in the faculty, obviously, who wrote a thesis as to why Haiti is perpetually impoverished. So that idea somehow got to Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson didn't think this up on his own. He's hearing it from Haitians, certainly, or he's hearing it from second-hand information, but ultimately it's among Haitian evangelicals who developed this notion, this interpretation. Robertson doesn't mention that ceremony, but it's clear that's what he should be alluding to. And the key difference, obviously, is that Robertson is talking just days after the earthquake. Campion is talking 9 months before the earthquake, which ties to the time question that Naomi raised. Because prophets, prophets have often identified a day when it's going to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, they scramble to think of another day. Campion, he just carefully avoids that. And just the other day, he placed on his Facebook page, there have been rumors circulating in Haiti. I had Haitian relatives at my house in February, and they said, have you heard what he said now? Have you heard what he said now? I said, no, what has he said now? 666,666 people will die in the next earthquake in Haiti. But he quickly went on his Facebook page once this rumor circulated, and he renounced that. He has a lie. I never said that. So he's a careful prophet. And I totally agree. Prophecy can be good or bad depending on its application, just like religion in general. No?
Any other questions for our guests?
Thank you very much for those powerful presentations of your papers. So I have maybe observation for both of you, and again you may comment on that. First of all, to Marcelo, you gave a list of Pentecostal, activities, which, for example, has, aspects of, syncretism. You're talking about the Halloweens, becoming a day of celebrating, the All Saints Day. And the nightclubs becoming, Christ night, clubs. or even the Catholic rock bands, in that world. Now, my observation regards, for example, the role, let's say, of the church. We see that, okay, there must be an element of, let's say, discernment, maybe to give, a sense of direction. I don't know what the church, is doing regarding these things. And maybe theologians of Pentecostalism, or we are talking about, charismatology, what they are saying, regarding this issue, because I believe there must be a sense of, direction, which has got to do with the spirituality of the people. And then secondly, regarding, Rev, you mentioned about entering into a pact, with the devil. And then you brought in the issue of voodooism, voodoo. I know that some researches have been done also regarding voodoo, for example, in West Africa, and they are giving different categories. And also, secondly, people are talking about even categories of voodooism in, let's say, Caribbean. And again, you bring in that issue of devil worship. So I don't know the relationship with what, let's say, you presented to us, and the idea of Satanism or devil worship. So that afterwards we say, what should be done? Because these, I think, the issues of, let's say, voodooism would it be called or referred to as devil worship? What would be your comment on that? Thank you.
Sure. To be clear, I love voodoo. I consider myself an advocate of this beautiful religion of extraordinary poetic stature. And from one respect, you could regard voodoo as a form of folk Catholicism, and many voodooists themselves, most voodooists I know are Catholics, and they have no qualms whatsoever with turning to, they'll go to the Catholic Church for Mass, and when you really need to talk to God, that's where you go, to the Catholic Church. The spirits, however, are closer, and those spirits you can find in the temple. And when Catholic saints are introduced in Congo, and at the end of the 15th century, a similar thing happens. Of course, Catholic saints are introduced to Africans. And when a Catholic priest introduces a saint and says, this person died a long time ago, but lives out there somewhere, and still has powers to intervene supernaturally in your lives, Africans had always believed that, so it made perfect sense. Right? And in regards to the question of demons, I was very interested in something that Professor Magesa was speaking of yesterday, and what mainstream churches have to learn from AICs about the Holy Spirit. I believe that mainstream churches have a great deal to learn from how people who practice voodoo understand Christianity. They should be listened to. What's to be done? I think Monsignor Mio began doing something that needs to be done. I think bishops need to listen to voodooists. After a long and tragic history of persecuting voodooists throughout the nation, and it hasn't worked. The religion still thrives. So, yeah.
Simon, thanks for your observation. I think the hierarchy is all the time in command. It's all the time. The movement, the charismatic movement, start this. Then, how I said, we have priests, charismatic priests, bishops, charismatics, and the Catholic Church in Brazil found a formula to maintain, like the most important church in Brazil, is to do the enculturation in modern society, is to use the media, the modern styles of life. They discover that we can enter in all aspects of the modern society, the Pentecostals too, but the Catholic Church discovered that just in putting the label of Christ. Then we can make the Christ Carnival, Christ Samba, Christ soccer. Then that's the Pentecostals do the same with the label gospel. Gospel, we have the gospel everything. Then it's a formula to that Catholic Church maintain his supremacy in our country. That occurs to me to say to you.
Yeah, just one other point that came to mind as I was listening to Marcelo speak, and I'm thinking of Brazil, Haiti, Cuba. The idea that the voodoo spirits who are called Roi are demons, that's entirely rooted in the history of missions, of course. And the idea that the Orishas in West Africa too, it's entirely rooted in the history of missions. Some of these spirits are themselves already destructive, so it was very easy to pin demons on them because they were destroying people's lives anyway, right? Like sickness derives from certain Orishas and Loi as well. So they're morally somewhat ambivalent from the beginning, but nonetheless they're not demons. So that idea comes from Christianity. But one thing that's been happening in these religions, not so much in voodoo, but in Candomblé in Brazil and Santeria in Cuba, and Santeria especially in New York and in Miami, is something referred to in the scholarly literature as re-Africanization. There are people who enter these religions at around the time of the rise of negritude, Pan-Africanism, black power movements, and they're entering a religion as African Americans and as black Cubans, and they're relying on white Cubans and white Puerto Ricans to learn the religion in New York City, certainly, and they're seeing all this Catholic stuff and they say, wait a second, this doesn't belong in our religion, we want a purely African religion. So they're getting rid of the Catholic icons from the temples, they're getting rid of the Catholic prayers in the services. That hasn't been happening so much in voodoo in Haiti, but in Cuban Santeria and Candomblé in Brazil, that does happen as well.
I want to say more on thing, the word syncretism. In Brazil, we are the syncretism country. And then the Catholic Church learned at the beginnings of our country. Then we have a kind of Afro-Candomblé, Umbanda rights that it needs to assist a mass, to go inside the church, and it's no problem to people. The most important the most important human priestess in Candomblé, which called Mãe Menininha do Cantuá, she said that she's Catholic. She's Catholic. It's no problem in Brazil historically to be Catholic and go to Candomblé and Umbanda. But this new movement like Charismatic and Pentecostal, they starts to bring a new movement against the African religion, Afro-Brazilian religions. It's a kind of modernity, because modernity is to separate. I'm Catholic and I'm not Protestant. I'm Protestant and I'm not Afro-Brazilian. In Brazil, we have this blend, and now the people said this attitude against the other religions like Protestant and Charismatic do. It's a modern way of life, but in other hand, they are against Afro-Brazilians, but they put the features, the Afro-Brazilian features inside their rituals. It's very interesting and very strange.
On that note, I think we should stop here, and please join me in thanking our speakers.